Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Passages Pulse. At the time of this recording, it is 11 a.m. Eastern Time on July 23, 2025. Today is Wednesday. My name is Sebastian, and I'm here with my colleague, Josiah McGee. Hey, Josiah, how's it going?
It's going well, Sebastian. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thank you for being with us. Yes, let's get off script a little bit. Let's check in with each other a little bit. Summer is coming up. It's ending, soon. Surprise, y'all. Go do something fun before summer ends. I'm kind of glad because temperatures have been really high. I'm looking for it to be like 15 degrees cooler. But what is one thing you hope to do before summer ends, Josiah?
I don't know. I think my checklist is almost done.
Okay.
At the 4th of July. That was great. Been able to do some stuff outside. A lot of time in the pool. Went to the beach over the weekend. So maybe I'm ahead of the game a little bit, but I feel like my summer's been pretty full already.
You are living a fun summer. That's cool, man. I live nearby this river called the Chattahoochee River, and I really want to go see it before. I've never been to it, lived around it for a while now, and I really, really want to go see it, walk by it, hike around it before summer. And so that's on my list. I'll check in like a month and see if I did it. Well, we hope you guys have been having a good summer. Let us know in the comments what is one thing you hope to accomplish, one thing you want to do, something fun before summer ends. But let's get now into our subject for today, because last week we discussed negotiations between a possible deal between Israel and Syria. Last week, while we were recording, and I think we introduced the podcast that way, conversations changed dramatically because of developments on the ground. And we told you last week that we're going to wait, see how it played out, and come back to you. Here we are to discuss the events. Israel intervened in a conflict between the Syrian government and its Druze minority. And just once again, Druze is spelled D-R-U-Z-E. They're a minority group in the Middle East. There's some in Israel, Lebanon, Syria. We're going to talk all about the Druze today, which is a minority. And Israel intervened by bombing 2 locations in the capital, in the city of Damascus, which was very dramatic. And Josiah will show some pictures later today. We're here today to try to make sense of the situation. What happened? Why? What does this mean? So let's get started. There are 3 chapters to our story. We're going to break this down. Chapter 1 will be describing the facts, what happened in this town called Sueda, and Josiah will show us pictures as well. So that's chapter 1. We're going to figure out what happened there. Chapter 2 is going to be how Israel responded to these actions. And chapter 3, the ceasefire that, thank God, as of right now, is kind of holding. So, Josiah, let's talk about Sueda first. I believe it could also call Al Sueda. Tell us about what happened in this town. And if you could, please show us a picture.
Yeah, of course. Well, before I show a quick picture, I think just a bit of rough chronology of events is helpful to understand sort of the big picture. It started really with a much smaller set of incidents that took place between Druze community in Sueda as well as some Bedouin communities both in Sueda and in the surrounding countryside. And what happened really again began as a small series of events, but then it escalated very quickly into some intense fighting between the 2 sides, the Druze and the Bedouin communities. Eventually, the Syrian government got involved as well. They sent their own security forces to presumably try to, reinstall or restore some sense of order in Sueda. And then what started to happen is clashes between the Syrian government forces as well as the Druze community in Sueda. Some clashes as well with even Druze civilians inside the city and the Syrian forces. Now, what followed then started to devolve very quickly into various forms of very ugly fighting, even reports of atrocities like kidnappings, mutilation in some cases, attacks again on civilians. And these were reported, frankly, on both sides. You have Druze forces that were accused of doing some pretty terrible things. You have members of the Syrian security forces accused of doing really horrific things. In most cases, I'll show a picture as well. The reports of religious hate crimes were typically reported as being conducted by members of the Syrian security forces. So you can see here a picture of an intentional act of humiliation, the shaving of the mustache of a Druze elderly man by a member of the Syrian security forces. This is really a really terrible thing. to do to someone, but an intentional act of humiliation and considered to be some sort of religious violence against the Druze community. So you have things like this happening. You also
Can
have
I
reports
intervene here
of
real quick, just for the audience understanding? As I understand it, and somebody correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but according to the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, which are called hadith, he encouraged his followers to shave their mustache, because having a mustache was like it's a Christian thing, or like a fire worshiper thing, or like a Persian thing. Anyways, so that's why have you guys ever wondered why some Muslim clerics grow their beard down here but shave their mustache? This is why, because the Prophet allegedly said in one of his sayings, the hadith, that to shave your mustache. So what they're doing right here is doing that to humiliate them. It's a Muslim thing that is done in many places. It's really sad to see this, to shave somebody like that. So I just wanted to intervene with that little tidbit.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And to your point, Sebastian, I think it's important people understand that this was an explicitly religious symbol or act of religious violence that was carried out against members of the Druze community by members of the Syrian security forces who are considered to be Islamist extremists, are previously, many of them from different foreign terror organizations that fought for al-Joulani before he became the president of Syria. You still have people like that who are part of Syrian security forces of the Syrian army. They were part of the crew that entered Ceuta and started carrying out some of these acts of violence. You also have reports of sexual violence, unfortunately, as well. And at the end of the day, what you wind up with is a situation in which you have people arguing essentially that, again, both sides are committing atrocities, but the Druze are getting the worst of it. And there might even be a genocide against the Druze taking place. And so you have people trying to mobilize international support around this idea that the Druze are being massacred and that a genocide of the Druze is taking place in southern Syria.
Well, that's what happened there in Sweden. That's how the violence started. And we started seeing this development last week when we were recording our podcast at the same time. So that's what happened. Tell us, Josiah, how did Israel respond, and how did Israeli Druze respond?
So there was a few different things that happened, I think. And again, you were starting to see some reports of this last week around the time that we were getting ready to record last week. There were reports of large numbers of Israeli Druze who were crossing the border into Syria, presumably to try to join the fight and defend the Druze in southern Syria, which is a rather unusual thing actually to have happen. That's not something that happens very frequently. Many Druze are very, very loyal to the state in which they reside. They become citizens of that state. They often fight for that state. So the idea that they would intentionally cross borders of a sovereign state or enter another state in order to fight for Druze in another country is a rather unique event. And that was something that was happening on a pretty large scale last week when the fighting was really intense. You also had an intervention by the IDF in a couple different ways. Some of that was going to look a little bit more targeted to areas around Ceuta and southern Syria, targeting different Syrian forces or munitions, or trying to control the situation and demilitarize the situation, essentially. But then the IDF really sort of, I would say, escalated when they chose to bomb Damascus. I'll put the picture up here that you mentioned as well, so people can see a bit of the damage that was done. There were two locations that were targeted in the Syrian capital of Damascus, one being the Syrian Ministry of Defense headquarters. You can see a picture here, some of the damage that was done to that building. And the rationale was, the orders to attack the Druze in Ceuta are coming from the Ministry of Defense. The organizing of troops and equipment to send them to southern Syria is being done in the Ministry of Defense in its headquarters. That's why we would attack this building. There also was an attack on a presidential compound, or a site near the presidential compound, near the presidential palace. It's, I think, for me at least, quite a bit less clear why that site was attacked. I haven't really heard a clear rationale for why you would attack something near the presidential palace in Damascus, at least not as clear as the rationale for attacking the Ministry of Defense. But both of these were major events and marked a pretty serious escalation in terms of Israel's actions in Syria, which have been ongoing since the Assad regime fell. I mean, they've been very active militarily in Syria for the last 6 months, at least, since the Assad regime fell. But this was a significant step further, and a more serious, more significant event, I think.
So just to recap, everybody. So what we got going on here is the Syrian government. They have they're being trying to get it together to restore rule of law and the monopoly of the state over violence. So all these factions are trying to come under the state. So you have these Bedouin forces that attacked this people, this ethnic group called the Druze, and now there was a ceasefire. So last week, thank God, a ceasefire was reached. So the Syrian security forces were able to re-enter the city, like the government coming to set law to stop these militias from fighting each other. Or actually, that's not fair, because it's not like the Druze are in a fair fight here. The Bedouins are the ones who attack them and are humiliating them. And as you mentioned the G word, the genocide, and that's what other Jews and analysts have called this as well. It's a genocidal intent. They're being targeted because of who they are, because of their ethnicity, because of their culture, also because of their religion. That's more of that in a moment. So Druze leaders should get some added to responsibility for the international security of the region and humanitarian assistance. There were some pictures of Israel going to the border, dropping off assistance, like big trucks with assistance for the citizens there, for the Druze people there. And it seems to be working for now. The situation is still very tense. And just before we move on, I just wanted to, again, just to clarify a little bit about this group. The Druze, as they claim to be the descendants of Jethro, father-in-law of Moses. This is what they claim to be. Other people outside the community would say that actually they're more like a 1,000-year-old offshoot of Islam, that that Muslims don't recognize them as real Muslims. They consider them a heretic group, and that's why they persecute them. But the Druze themselves have a very secretive religion. Actually, people who are members of the community, the women don't even know what they believe, or like everything they believe. Allegedly, only very few men are able to actually believe or understand or know what the religion is about. And I'm trying to bring this up for one point, because the reason why they do that is because of persecution. They have been persecuted through the decades, through the centuries. So, in order to protect themselves, they have become very insular and protective of their beliefs because they're persecuted. So, they're a very interesting group, but they're citizens of Israel. The ones in Israel are citizens, have been very faithful fighters from the beginning of the state of Israel. And there is this covenant between the Jewish people and the Druze people that we will protect each other. So in Israel, there are generals who are Druze, soldiers, commanders, chiefs of staff have been Druze. So these are people who give their lives, who fight for the country, and now they need their country to go and defend their brethren, their brothers and sisters on the other side of the border. So that's why this is a very interesting dynamic here. But so Josiah, I just wanted to take a moment to make sure that everybody understands. I didn't know about this group until I visited Israel. So that's what happened. That's how Israel responded. But let's go back. Let's go about to what sparked this. As far as you can assess, what do you think this violence broke out in the first place?
I think it's been really, really hard to understand that since the violence broke out, because you have a lot of different competing narratives. Of course, social media went nuts over this, obviously, and there wasn't a ton of international media coverage, but what little international media coverage there was, of course, there were disputing reports or contradictory reports about how this started, who's at fault, what are the motivations for the fighting. To be honest, I think it is probably not one right answer, but several contributing factors behind what's going on in this conflict. So I'll try to lay them out, and we can discuss which ones make sense, which ones don't. But there are some layers I think people might not be as aware of. For example, some would argue that this is primarily an ethnic conflict between the Bedouin and the Druze, or maybe a sectarian conflict between the two, but that there is some ethnic element to this. There's some rivalry between the two communities. And part of that is because there are accusations or allegations that both Bedouin and Druze communities are engaged in organized crime, criminal activity like drug smuggling, weapon smuggling, things of that nature. So it would make a little bit of sense that, okay, maybe the conflict started in part over some competition over the smuggling routes in southern Syria. Maybe not, but it's one possible factor that was at play. Another factor that is possibly at play is that it was a religious conflict. Not all of, but some of the Bedouin communities in southern Syria did at least loosely, if not formally, associate with ISIS when it was very strong in Syria. So, of course, yes, there is some strong Islamist undercurrent running through the Bedouin community. The Druze community is not Shia, but it did align itself. There's really multiple Druze communities that follow different leaders in southern Syria, but the one that was really at the forefront of this fighting is the one that aligned itself most closely with the Assad regime. So it's not a Shia group, but it did align itself with the Shia group. And so, of course, the Sunni Islamists in the region have some motivation for religious conflict with this Druze community, both because they are Druze and not Muslim per se, but also because they align themselves with their Shia rivals in the past as well. So you do have that angle. You have other things that I think are a little bit interesting to think about as well. If you think about not just why there's fighting between the Bedouin and the Druze, but think about, okay, why was there fighting between the Syrian security forces and the Druze, and maybe a bit more intense than what you saw between the Syrian security forces and the Bedouins, that they were also trying to sort of, put back in their place, restore order and that sort of thing. I think there's some interesting questions about, what sort of role do power politics play in this situation? There's, to your point, Sebastian, earlier, there's this really interesting dynamic playing out in Syria right now where the new government is trying to establish effective control over the country, trying to unify the different territories, some of which are threatening to become break-off territories. Northeast Syria, you've got the Kurds who are trying to negotiate for some sort of autonomy. You have the Druze in southern Syria. And there's very real questions and challenges about, can we actually make sure that, all of Syrian territory is unified under the effective centralized control of the new Syrian government? Are we going to have these like semi-autonomous regions with their own militias and their own governments that are trying to control these different territories? And this group, this specific Druze group that was at the center of much of the fighting, has been one of those examples of a group that's been advocating for some autonomy and trying to limit the control and the influence of the new Syrian government in southern Syria, has been opposed to the new Syrian government led by al-Joulani. That begs the question, okay, is this just some sort of, organized crime rivalry? Is this some sort of purely religious conflict between the Bedouin and the Druze? Or is this a chess move by the new Syrian government that are using the Bedouin as pawns to create an excuse to send Syrian security forces into Ceuta and put down this potential insurrection by the Druze against the new Syrian government? That's plausible. I mean, all of these explanations sound semi-plausible. And I think at the end of the day, you do have to acknowledge the fact that it's not the first attack on minorities by the Syrian security forces, typically religious minorities. There have been others as well, like the Alawites or Christians in some cases, that have been attacked either by the Syrian security forces or not protected from attacks by groups that claim to be ISIS or something like that.
Right.
So there is some track record of this as well, and you can't really discount the possibility that this really was a form of an attack on a minority, a deliberate attack on a religious minority. But given the big picture of all of the different things happening in Syria right now, again, it's just my personal opinion. My personal opinion is that it's not as simple as any one answer, that there was a lot of different things creating this mess of a situation that led to this really horrible violence and the atrocities that took place, because there's just so much going on in Syria right now.
As you guys can hear, it's quite complicated, as you can say. As you just said, Josiah, it's not just one answer, because just listen to all the people groups that he's mentioned. He's mentioned Sunnis, Shia, Alawites, Druze, the Jewish people, the Kurds in the north part of Syria. It's a quite complicated region, Josiah. And let me throw this at you. So one of the dynamics here is the political commentary people that if the United States backs Israel in this conflict with Iran, America is going to be dragged into a war. Lots of people will die. One of the, you and I love, I joked before, you and I wake up and we go to Times of Israel and we read the news of the day. We do that before we go to sleep too. Let me paint a picture. There are some people who probably don't pay a whole lot of attention every day, but they're going to get the major headlines. And in the last 2 years, what the headlines will look like, Josiah, is going to be like, Israel bombs Lebanon. Israel kills the Hamas guy in Iran. Israel bombs Iran. Israel bombs Syria. Israel bombs Yemen. So it just sounds like Israel's bombing a lot of people all over the place. Why do you think Israel responded the way it did? You show us those pictures. One thing is to say Israel bombs Damascus. The other thing is to show us the damage that was done to the capital of Damascus. So it sounds like Israel's the bad guy to some people. Why do you think Israel responded the way that it did to this situation?
Well, it's really quite interesting that you ask that, because I think I'll reserve for a moment my perspective on whether Israel should have responded the way that it did.
Okay.
But I do think it's important to put all the cards on the table about the various reasons why different people think that Israel responded the way that it did. And one of the things that is important to put on the table, to your point, that Israel is very active across the region right now. There are people inside Israel from Channel 12, I think it was Amit Segal, made a comment last week, I think it was, after the bombing of the the different buildings in Damascus, he made a comment that Israel right now is acting like a regional superpower, really for the first time in its history. Yes, Israel has intervened very actively throughout the region in the past and in some ways acted like it's a superpower. But the real test of a regional superpower is when you intervene on someone else's behalf and not for your own self-defense. And this is, in his estimation, perhaps the first time that Israel's actively intervened in another country, not for its own self-defense, but in defense of someone else. And basically, what the implication is that, after the massive successes that Israel has enjoyed post October 7, obviously October 7 was a very scary moment for Israel. It was an existential crisis. But since then, it has enjoyed some pretty significant success, militarily speaking, against its enemies like Hezbollah or like Iran. It's seen the Assad regime fall in Syria and really weaken the Iranian axis. And all of a sudden, Israel has a lot more influence and ability to influence regional politics than it did previously. And it's choosing to exercise that. It's flexing its muscles in a way that it really hasn't previously. And what he suggested is that in and of itself is a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of Israeli politics and the way that it views itself and its place in the Middle East. It's interesting. I think you do have to kind of contemplate what does that mean for the future of the Middle East if Israel believes that is its place now in the Middle East as a regional superpower that can, frankly, dictate terms of regional politics to some of its neighbors. The second thing that I think you really have to understand, and you already, I think Sebastian made a good point, that there's this long-standing history between Israel and its Druze community, is the importance of that relationship. It is a very, very strategic and moral relationship. There are many Druze, just throw up an example here, a photo for you, who have fought in the IDF valiantly for many years. You referenced this. Many of the heroes of October 7, people who ran to the south in order to respond to the attack by Hamas, were Druze. They mobilized to defend the country just as quickly as any of their Jewish comrades in the IDF. And they believe that they are part of the state of Israel, that their fate is deeply intertwined with the Jewish people. At the same time, they also believe that they're connected to their brothers in Syria. So that sense of connection that is so deep between Israel and its Druze community, I think cannot be overstated how significant that is in terms of its decision to deploy IDF resources in Syria to defend the Druze there. I'm honestly not sure that you would see as much time and energy invested in defending the Druze in southern Syria if it were not for the fact that there is such a strong relationship with the Druze community in Israel itself.
Right, and
the last thing...
Sorry, that picture that you have there, that's the flag of the Druze people, right? Just for our audience information. There they are serving. And also one more political thing here, Josiah, is that whereas 25% of Israel is Orthodox, and many of these people or these individuals for religious reasons don't want to serve in the army. Meanwhile, the Druze community, they have to serve. They have a mandatory service requirement for the men. The women don't have to serve. It's one or two minorities of Israel that are mandated to serve: the Circassians, which is a whole other group, and the Druze. So these are people dying and giving their lives for Israel. So that's why they feel like the Israeli government should go to protect their people, their brethren in the other side of the border too.
Yeah, exactly. And what you mentioned as well, the lineage claiming to go as far back as Jethro, there's also is this strong sense that there's a familial tie that's very, very old. It's not a new relationship that was established when the state of Israel was established. It goes back. There are various people. I think there was an interesting podcast that we were discussing offline before we started recording. Haviv had someone on his podcast last week talking about this. And one of the points that she made was that the relationship between the Druze and the Jewish people in Israel goes back hundreds of years, way before the state of Israel was established. They've been in very close community. So
yeah, she talks about some
there
famous
is something
rabbi
to that
coming to pre-state Israel, and then they're talking about the Druze community being very welcoming to them and very nice to them. So yeah, it goes back hundreds of years.
It's a real thing. I think that you can't discount the importance of that. On a more strategic geopolitical level, I think why would Israel get involved in the way that they have? I also think in the same way that Joulani is very concerned about the unification of Syria, Israel is as well, frankly. I'll just again, one more visual. This map, I think, is a helpful resource as well. Wow. So you
Look
can
how
see
much bigger Syria is compared to Israel. It's huge.
It is very big, yeah. But it's still a very fractured state in some ways. amount of territory that the Syrian government actually has effective control over is not necessarily as big as you would think. As you can see, Sueda's in southern Syria, relatively close to the border with Jordan. That's where a lot of the smuggling routes are. It's one of the reasons why there is some allegations of the smuggling trade in the areas, because of how close it is to the border with Jordan and the cross-border traffic that takes place there of both drugs and weapons. You can see here as well why Israel might have an interest in what happens in Suez, because it is very close to Jordan. It's also relatively close to the Golan Heights, at least compared to northeastern Syria. So this is part of the area that Israel has been arguing since the fall of the Assad regime, that they don't want to see any militarization in this area. They don't want to see a buildup of military power belonging to the new Syrian government in southern Syria, because they don't trust, frankly, the Syrian government to use it for the right purposes and not to give it over to different Islamist groups. And so there is a geopolitical reason why Israel would get involved, not just the moral cause of defending the Druze people, although I do think that's real, that many Israelis feel that sincerely. There is also this geopolitical angle to Israel's strategic interest in what happens in southern Syria.
Well, Josiah, as we talk about this situation, for us as Christians now, we must think about how we're going to respond. How are we going to respond to this situation? One thing I wanted to throw in here, maybe you guys have seen this little graphic that is thrown around, because one aspect that we're trying to approach here is the potential for genocide of another minority group being attacked for who they are because of the culture and their religion. And if Israel doesn't intervene, who's going to come and defend these people? There's talking of mustaches again, there is a graphic that goes around sometimes that if we had prevented the Armenian genocide, these are the Turkish genocide of the Armenian people, maybe this genocide of the Jewish people could have been prevented. Of course, I don't know how true that is, but it's something that people make, that point that people make. So Israel had a choice to make here. They were a minority group for which they have an international interest in, that's being attacked. So tell us, how do you think Christians should respond? And I will close us out with other similar thoughts as well.
I think it's tricky. You don't want to overthink or overcomplicate situations when they really are simple. I think for some of the reasons that I shared earlier in the episode, it's not very clear that this really is a simple black and white issue, and that there aren't some interesting motivations on the various sides at play here. Part of why this is so complicated is because it's not just one or two groups fighting. It's really at least three different groups fighting: the Bedouin, Druze, and the Syrian forces. And then among them, you have different rogue actors and a wide variety of agendas. So I think that makes it fairly challenging to think about how Christians should respond to this situation. I'll break down a few things that I think are important from my perspective for Christians to think about, though. Number one, I think Israel had very good reason to intervene. And it's a good thing that Israel did, because there was a pretty serious crime that was occurring in southern Syria. The atrocities, the reports coming out, there's every reason, at least right now, to believe that the reports were true and that really horrible things were happening and needed to be stopped. So it's a good thing that someone intervened. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone, even inside Israel, is on the same page about whether Israel's interventions were most effective or the way that Israel intervened was the right approach. I think there's some question marks about that, which are fair to discuss and debate. If you listen even to the U.S. administration, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, you're going to hear some different critiques, things like, I really wish that Israel might have coordinated more closely with the United States, who was trying to negotiate for a ceasefire, and Israel, bombed the capital city of Damascus. I mean, that's a fairly drastic step to take when the U.S. is trying to put out the fire. And so I think it's fair to have a conversation about whether that was a necessary step or whether a more limited intervention could have protected the Druze and allowed Israel to coordinate more closely with its ally in the United States. I also think there are things that will be disputed and studied, and eventually I think the truth will come out that we're going to need to eventually grapple with. One example of that is this sort of statement made by Secretary of State, again, Marco Rubio, something to the effect of, this came down to this direct clash between Israel and the Syrian government in Damascus comes down to misunderstanding. Wild that could be the case, but what he's referring to is a series of meetings in Azerbaijan prior to conflict breaking out between the Syrian government and the Druze. These meetings in Azerbaijan were between Israeli officials and Syrian officials who were having conversations about a potential, not necessarily a peace deal. It's become a little bit less likely that, they're going to join the Abraham Accords in the near future, but some kind of demilitarization agreement or agreement about the security status of southern Syria and the Golan Heights. During that meeting, supposedly, there was a verbal agreement about whether or not Syrian forces could enter Sueda and the IDF would stay out of the way. And supposedly, something happened, wires were crossed, and they left the meeting with very different impressions of what had been agreed to verbally. And then that apparently led to Israel responding by, again, bombing Damascus. A really unfortunate series of events, if that's actually the reason why things escalated so quickly, is, a misunderstanding of a verbal agreement that is unfortunate. And again, I think something that it's worth asking, okay, are there better ways of intervening when necessary, but making sure that things don't get out of hand? Does it necessarily need to escalate to the degree that it did? Not everyone is in agreement on that. And I think there's room for some debate there about how did this happen? What can we learn about the future moving forward? That sort of thing. And again, I think a lot of it is just the rationale for bombing Damascus is very different than the rationale for bombing Syrian forces or convoys headed to Sueda. The rationale for bombing even the Syrian Ministry of Defense is stronger than the rationale for bombing the presidential compound. So the choice of targets and whether it really needed to escalate to that degree, I think, again, room for debate. Now, having said all of that, I want to get back to the basics, the brass tacks of what should we actually take away from the situation? What are the non-negotiables? Again, just my opinion, my perspective in terms of how Christians should respond. Number one, we absolutely should be very concerned for the safety of religious minorities in Syria. The strategic wisdom of the different ways that different parties intervened, both the US and Israel, in order to protect religious minorities can be debated, but the fact that religious minorities were under attack and needed to be protected is not really up for debate. At this point, that's pretty well understood as fact. And it should be very concerning that religious minorities continue to come under attack from different groups in Syria. Best case scenario, it means that the Syrian government does not have effective control of its own security forces and that they are out there attacking religious minorities like Christians or Druze or Alawites. Worst case scenario, the Syrian government does have effective control of those forces and it's allowing them to carry out these attacks in a malicious manner. Either way, neither scenario is good. And we should be very concerned about that. We should be actively advocating for some changes that are needed in order to ensure the safety of religious minorities in Syria, like the Druze, like the Alawites, and like our Christian brothers and sisters. The last thing I would say is that, again, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to support every specific intervention, but we do need to be praying very carefully about what we can support and how we can not just symbolically, but practically show our support for those minorities. There are ways that you can do that. Calling a congressman, writing a letter, or doing something to show where your priorities are, and that we do support those religious minorities that are under attack. I think it's important that we are taking those steps as Christians.
Well, friends, I hope that by hearing Josiah give you this detailed explanation, I hope that will inform your prayers, because this is a very smart way to pray, very well-informed way to pray about this whole situation. There's a lot of dynamics. I want to say a few things as we finish up our podcast today. One, of course, we should lament. Lament. That picture of this old man being shaved is so heartbreaking for me, Josiah. They're seeing this defenseless old man who has nobody to defend him. Nobody's coming to his rescue. And this is the story of so many minorities in the Middle East, including Christians in many places, like the Assyrian Christians who were defenseless when ISIS came for them. So we need to lament that this tragedy is happening. The Middle East is a very fragmented place, very tribal place. And most of these tribes are like, it's my tribe versus all of you. And that's it. There's no room for nuance at all. The second thing, we need to acknowledge our past. As Christians, this thing that's happening between like this Bedouin Muslims coming in to kill this minority of Druze. One could say 1,000 years ago, this is what we were going through in Europe, maybe 500 years ago, where you had Protestants versus Catholics, and even before the East versus the West when in the Roman Empire. So we have had our own share of religious warring, religious violence in Christians, but thank God we have one word to describe this would be reform. We have reformed our way out of that. And from a secular point of view, many people say this is what Islam needs. Islam needs a reformation to go past these tribal conflicts. I think from a Christian point of view, we need to pray. I think we need to pray that the gospel will go out, that in these areas where minorities are persecuted. And I think I say this as an immigrant, we need to praise God for the United States, for religious freedom that we have here. In the United States, we were formed by people fleeing religious persecution. I want to shout out one name out there for you guys to go read and learn something. If you haven't know about this person, Roger Williams. He was in Rhode Island, and he was a Baptist guy who believed in the freedom of religion to make sure that everybody can practice their religion. Because if there's one state religion, then you don't know who's a true believer. So by having religious freedom, we can share the gospel and we can have genuine conversions and genuine confessions of faith. Otherwise, it's just a church state and everybody's a Christian, which has not worked very well in history. So I know it's a weird way that we started talking about the Druze in Syria and we ended up with Roger Williams. But I just wanted to highlight how much I appreciate religious freedom in this country and thank God. So we should praise God for the United States and we should pray for Israel. Again, Israel is the one place in the Middle East where many minorities are saved. There are Christians, there are Baha'i, there are Circassians, there are Druze, there are even Black Hebrew Israelites have their own little commune going on over there. Just all kinds of minority groups have found a safe haven in Israel because Israel respects freedom of religion. And we need to celebrate and be thankful for that. We need to pray for Israeli leaders, as Josiah described. Maybe some in the Israeli government are feeling like really strong, and that hubris can lead to mistakes, to pride and to overstepping maybe a little bit. So they need to have wisdom to act. And Israeli society is tired. I think Israeli society is tired. Coming up on 2 years of the October 7th, there are still hostages being held. Apparently, Josiah, this week, Steve Witkoff, the chief negotiator, is going to Doha, see if we can have a deal. If that happens, we'll talk about it next week here on our podcast. But we just need to pray for Israel in general. They've been going through 2 very long years of all sorts of conflicts in different theaters. So we'll just pray that this ceasefire will hold and that minorities in Syria will be protected. Well, Josiah, thank you so much for addressing this conflict today. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we go?
No, I think you've summarized very well how we should be praying. Definitely a lot of us will be praying, and I hope that if anyone from the Druze community hears this episode, that you do hear our support and that our prayers are with you for your safety during this time.
Yeah, definitely. And all of you, please go Google Roger Williams and appreciate a little bit of our religious freedom in our country. Thank you, Josiah. Thank you to our producers, Avery and Lindsay. Let us know in the comments if you have any questions, and we look forward to seeing you all next week in another episode of the Passages Pulse. Yalla, thank you. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.